Everyone, and welcome back to this week's video. And in this week's video, we'll be stepping aside from our topics of faithful and beautiful characteristics we should show and take into consideration of the next important event that is coming in this year, being the Lord's Memorial. So, as we know, in the days and weeks slowly it's leading up to this year's memorial celebration, which will be after sundown on April 11th, Friday, we can say. So to get ready according towards the understanding of the purpose of this event, we're going to be talking about the Lord's Memorial in this week's video. However, we're going to be taking it in a different manner to how the structure of the Lord's Memorial is normally explained, we can see, as we're going to go into more of a more systematic approach to understanding the Lord's Memorial. So the first reference we need to understand about the Lord's Memorial itself is one particular verse that's going to sum up our today's topic. And I'm not going to explain much about this verse, but it's a very key verse that we must understand, which is, it says in 1 Corinthians 5th chapter 7th verse, it says, "Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened." So it's a very symbolic reference towards the key being the leavened and unleavened bread, we can see. So we first have to understand what this verse is trying to say, we have to say. So the first references to leavened are in connections with the Lord's instructions concerning the original Passover supper. We know much about the great Passover and this absolute wonderful miracles that took place during the 10 plagues and how the Passover supper took place, we can see. As we saw, it was during the period of the Passover supper. It was eaten by the Israelites the night before they were delivered from their bondage in Egypt, we can see. However, the unleavened bread was to be used at the Passover supper, we see. At the time, God also gave instructions concerning a 7-day feast. However, this is the key information we're going to delve in this week's video. That God gave us instructions concerning a 7-day feast to immediately follow the Passover supper, where it says in Exodus 12 chapter 15th verse, where we can read it's saying, "For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel itself," we can see. So we need to understand the use of leaven was specifically prohibited by God, we can see, in connection with nearly all the sacrifices which the Israelites offered to him. Leaven was a key principle that was used during this Passover supper, we can say. And we can say, literally speaking, the leaven is actually yeast, we can say. Although yeast adds much flavor to bread and other foods when properly used and preserved, it also ferments easily, which is the key symbolism to understanding the purpose of unleavened bread and leavened bread. We can see when it's fermented, it soon spoils any food which it is mixed or even comes within close contact. We gather from this natural characteristics that God uses leaven in the Bible as an illustration or symbolic representation of sin in all its various corrupting aspects, we can say. So we have to understand that these natural characteristics that God uses leaven is an illustration of the sins that is corrupting us in various aspects, we can see. This thought is borne out by Jesus himself, suggesting the idea of that this is the case, and this is how leavened bread should truly be seen, we can see, and how careful we have to be in particular when we approach individuals like this. Because not only had the scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees leavened or corrupted the teachings of God's words by their traditions, but they had also symbolically symbolically speaking, permitted leaven to enter their hearts, to influence their course of action with respect to the service to their God, we can say. So through that symbolism, through that speaking, he's permitting the leaven to enter their hearts. While leaven maybe seem good and have loads of flavor, we can say, ultimately it is what soon spoils the food, and it corrupts everything around it and spoils everything around it, we can say. So there's a very sinister understanding we have to understand of the leavened bread and how we should be very careful about the impacts on us, we can see. Then later in church at Corinth, there was an individual who was not deporting himself in harmony, we can see, with the principles of righteousness at that point in time. And then the apostle Paul himself instructed this brethren a specific task, where he says in 1 Corinthians 5th chapter, the 5th to 6th verse, saying, "Hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord. Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that little yeast leavens a whole batch of dough?" We can see, so the clear symbolism is represented here. So the little corruption that resides within you will corrupt a whole amount of yourself and those around you, it's suggesting. So get rid of the old yeast so that you may be new and an unleavened batch, as you really are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. So, overall, in this video, we have seen that leaven is a symbolic of that which corrupts. There is leaven of false doctrine, the leaven of hypocrisy, and the leaven of malice, we can see, and wickedness, and the leaven of the sinful flesh in its various manifestations. So there's loads of ways how the leaven corrupts us ultimately, and how we have to be careful in many scenarios where those who are willing to, we can see, who at first that adds much flavor, and it is nice to see these characteristics. In the long run, it is you who's going to be corrupted by these sinful characteristics. So we need to understand, as we prepare our hearts during this memorial session, let us remember the lessons concerning leaven and how careful we should truly be. But we also have to remember that these lessons, which all the consecrated should take to heart and apply every day of the year, not just in this point of period, we can see, to show we are unleavened. We should always be alert of the leaven in any form. As we saw, there's many forms of leaven, and we should it will find a way in our hearts, and it will find a way to live in us and corrupt us and corrupt our hope and destroy our faith, we see. Maybe it be the determination of all the Lord's consecrated people to be faithful of our Heavenly Father. For that's the key aspect we must show throughout our period, acting like the unleavened, if we want to achieve that glory. So, ultimately, that's all I have to say. That key verse, "Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened." A key verse we need to understand, especially during this period of memorial, how it links to this period beautifully, and how we must showcase this throughout our time, not just in a period where we have something to remember of the great Jesus Christ. So that's all for this week's video. See you next week, and we'll continue more about this in coming videos. See you next week. Bye.